My name is Aisha Brahman, and I buried my husband in a red silk dress. Let me be clear, I didn't choose red to be scandalous or attention-seeking. I chose red because it was Richard's favorite color on me, because it reminded everyone in that funeral parlor that I was still very much alive, and because I knew it would absolutely infuriate my son Eric and his calculating wife Vanessa, who had spent the last 5 years treating me like an inconvenient obstacle to their inheritance. At 59, I've learned that grief doesn't have to make you weak. Sometimes it can make you dangerous. The funeral was everything Richard would have wanted: elegant, understated, attended by the city's most influential people. Richard Brahman had built his empire from nothing, turning a small construction company into a $55 million fortune that included real estate developments, luxury hotels, and investment portfolios that most people could only dream about. I stood at the front of the chapel, accepting condolences with the grace of someone who had been groomed for this role. 32 years of marriage to a powerful man teaches you how to hold yourself, how to smile through pain, how to project strength even when your world has crumbled. "Aisha, darling, you look absolutely stunning," whispered Margaret Worthington, one of the city's premier socialites. "Richard would be so proud of how beautifully you're handling this." "Thank you, Margaret." Richard always said life was for the living. But even as I played the part of the gracious widow, my attention kept drifting to Eric and Vanessa, who stood near the back of the chapel like vultures circling prey. Eric, my 38-year-old son who had inherited his father's dark hair but none of his integrity, wore his grief like an ill-fitting suit. Vanessa, blonde and beautiful in that sharp, predatory way that some men find irresistible, kept checking her phone between fake tears. They thought I couldn't see them, but I caught every whispered conversation, every calculating glance. During the service, while the pastor spoke about Richard's legacy of hard work and generosity, I watched Vanessa lean over to Eric and whisper something that made him smirk. After the burial, as mourners gathered at my estate for the reception, I played the perfect hostess. I circulated through the rooms, accepting sympathies, sharing memories of Richard, ensuring everyone felt welcomed and appreciated. It was what Richard would have expected, and more importantly, it was what I needed them to see. I was in the kitchen, directing the catering staff, when I heard Eric's voice from the adjacent hallway. He was speaking to someone, probably Vanessa, in the low, confident tone he used when he thought he was being clever. "Don't expect a dime from Dad's $55 million, he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "She's been living off his success for decades. Now it's our turn." I stood frozen, holding a crystal wine glass that suddenly felt impossibly heavy in my hands. "We are in charge now," came Vanessa's reply, her voice dripping with the kind of entitlement that made my blood run cold. "She can play widow all she wants, but the real power moves to us." Finally, I set the glass down carefully, my hands steady despite the fury building in my chest. For 5 years, ever since Eric married Vanessa, I'd watched my son transform from the loving child I'd raised into this cold, calculating stranger. I'd seen Vanessa's influence poison his heart, turning him against me with subtle manipulations and not-so-subtle greed. But hearing them discuss my husband's fortune, my life's work alongside Richard, like it was already theirs, while his body was still warm in the ground. That was the moment I decided that if Eric wanted war, I would give him elegance, precision, and complete annihilation. I walked back into the reception with my head high and my smile perfect. I accepted more condolences, shared more memories, played the part of the grieving but resilient widow. But inside, something had crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. Richard used to say that the most dangerous opponent was the one who smiled while they planned your destruction. He taught me everything about business, about reading people, about the art of strategic patience. My son was about to learn that his mother had been an excellent student. "Aisha, how are you holding up?" asked Charles Whitmore, Richard's longtime attorney and one of our closest family friends. Charles was in his 70s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of legal mind that had helped Richard build his empire. Though I suppose we'll need to discuss practical matters soon. Of course. Richard's will is quite straightforward, but we should meet within the week to go over everything. There are some specific provisions he wanted me to explain to you personally. I caught the slight emphasis on specific and filed it away for later consideration. Charles had been Richard's confidant for over 25 years. If anyone knew the full scope of my husband's final arrangements, it would be him. I'd appreciate that. Perhaps Tuesday afternoon. Perfect. And Aisha. Charles lowered his voice. Richard was very thorough about protecting your interests. I think you'll find his arrangements quite satisfactory. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Eric and Vanessa approached me near the front door. Eric had loosened his tie and looked eager to escape, while Vanessa maintained her mask of appropriate grief. "Mom," Eric said, his voice carefully neutral, "we wanted to check on you before we left. This must be so overwhelming."
"Sweetheart,
"Your father and I planned for this day, even though we hoped it would never come." Vanessa stepped closer, her expression shifting to something that might have been concern if you didn't know her better. "Aisha, we want you to know that we're here for you. Whatever you need, whatever decisions have to be made about the estate, we're here to help." The word help came out with just enough emphasis to make her real meaning clear. They weren't offering assistance. They were positioning themselves to take control. "That's very thoughtful," I replied smoothly, though I imagine Richard's arrangements will handle most of the details. He was always so thorough about these things. Eric's eyes sharpened slightly. "What do you mean, arrangements?" "Oh, just the usual estate planning. Wills, trusts, that sort of thing. Nothing for you to worry about right now." I smiled warmly. The picture of a woman who was grateful for her son's concern but didn't quite understand the complexities of financial planning. Vanessa and Eric exchanged a quick glance. The kind of look that passes between co-conspirators who think they're being subtle. "Well," Vanessa said, "we just want to make sure you're not burdened with decisions you shouldn't have to make alone. Financial matters can be so complicated." How considerate. But I'm sure Charles will guide me through everything. Richard trusted him completely. After they left, I walked through the empty house. Our house, the home Richard and I had built together over nearly 3 decades. Every room held memories, every piece of furniture a story. But now it also held the echo of my son's words, "Don't expect a dime from Dad's $55 million. I poured myself a glass of Richard's best whiskey and sat in his study, surrounded by the books and awards and photographs that told the story of his remarkable life. On his desk, exactly where he'd left it, was a framed photo of Eric from his college graduation 12 years ago. The young man in that picture looked nothing like the calculating stranger who'd just left my house. But that young man was gone, replaced by someone who saw his mother as an obstacle to wealth rather than the woman who'd loved and supported him for 38 years. I raised my glass in a silent toast to my husband's memory and to the lesson Eric was about to learn about underestimating the wrong woman. The game had begun, and I intended to win. Before we dive deeper into this absolutely wild story of inheritance, revenge, and family betrayal, make sure you hit that like button if you're already loving where this is going. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. And drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by family? Because Aisha is about to show us all how it's done. Now, let's see what happened when she met with the lawyer. The morning after the funeral, I woke up in the master bedroom I'd shared with Richard for 32 years and felt the crushing weight of silence. No gentle snoring from his side of the bed, no rustle of newspaper from the sitting area where he always took his first cup of coffee, No quiet humming from the shower as he prepared for another day of building his empire. But instead of surrendering to grief, I found myself thinking about Eric's words. Don't expect a dime from Dad's $55 million. Where had I gone wrong? When had my loving, sensitive little boy become this cold stranger who discussed his inheritance while his father's body was still warm? I knew exactly when. The day he married Vanessa 5 years ago. Eric had always been ambitious. That was the Brahmin way. Richard had instilled in him the importance of hard work, education, and building something meaningful. Eric had earned his MBA, worked his way up through different departments at Brahmin Enterprises, and seemed genuinely committed to learning the business from the ground up. Then came Vanessa. She was beautiful, I'll give her that. Model tall with honey blonde hair, sharp green eyes, and the kind of sophisticated style that turned heads at charity galas and business dinners. When Eric first brought her home 6 years ago, I'd tried to welcome her warmly. She was intelligent, well-educated, from a respectable family. On the surface, she seemed perfect for my son. But there were signs, little things that made my maternal instincts prickle with unease. The way she calculated the value of everything in our home with her eyes. The questions she asked about Richard's business, always framed as innocent curiosity but probing for specific financial details. The subtle way she began isolating Eric from his old friends, his college relationships, even some family connections. Mom, Vanessa thinks we spend too much time talking about the past, Eric had said during one of our weekly dinners, about 3 years into their relationship. She says I need to focus on building my own legacy instead of living in Dad's shadow. At the time, I'd thought it might be healthy for Eric to establish his independence. But Vanessa's version of independence seemed to mean cutting ties with anyone who knew Eric before she came along. The wedding had been beautiful, a $300,000 affair that Richard had paid for without complaint. Vanessa had insisted on the most expensive venue, the most elaborate flowers, the most exclusive catering. Every detail was perfect, and every detail was someone else's money. She's got expensive tastes, Richard had murmured to me during the reception, watching Vanessa direct the photographer to capture every angle of her custom-designed dress. She loves Eric, I'd replied, trying to convince myself as much as him. That's what matters. But Richard had given me one of his knowing looks, the same expression he wore when evaluating a risky business deal. Love and ambition aren't always the same thing, sweetheart. How right he'd been. After the wedding, the changes in Eric became more pronounced. The weekly family dinners became monthly, then sporadic. The phone calls shortened from long conversations about his life and dreams to brief, perfunctory check-ins. When Vanessa quit her marketing job 8 months after the wedding, claiming she wanted to focus on supporting Eric's career, I should have seen it as the red flag it was. Instead, Eric began working longer hours, taking on more responsibilities at Brahmin Enterprises, positioning himself as Richard's heir apparent. But something was different about his motivation. Where Richard had built the business out of genuine passion for creation and innovation, Eric seemed driven purely by the desire to accumulate wealth and status. I want to expand into luxury real estate, Eric had announced during one family dinner 2 years ago. High-end condos, exclusive developments. The profit margins are incredible. And the risk? Richard had asked mildly. That's what makes it exciting. Go big or go home, right? Vanessa had beamed at him like he'd just announced the cure for cancer. Eric's vision is so ambitious. He's going to take Brahmin Enterprises to levels you never imagined. The subtle dig at Richard's accomplishments hadn't been lost on me, and I'd seen my husband's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. But he'd said nothing, choosing to let Eric learn from his own mistakes rather than crushing his confidence with criticism. The real turning point had come 8 months ago, when Richard was diagnosed with a heart condition that would ultimately kill him. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic. With proper treatment and lifestyle changes, He could have had several more years. But the diagnosis had triggered something ugly in Eric and Vanessa. They'd begun hovering, asking pointed questions about estate planning, suggesting that Richard should simplify his affairs to make things easier for me when the time came. Vanessa had even offered to help me understand the financial side of things since I'd never had to deal with business matters alone. The condescension had been breathtaking. I'd been Richard's partner in every sense of the word, involved in major business decisions, sitting on the boards of his companies, using my social connections to open doors and build relationships that had been crucial to his success. But in Vanessa's narrative, I was just the decorative wife who needed protection from the complexities of the real world. The final insult had come just 3 weeks before Richard's death, when Eric had suggested that it might be time for his father to step back from active management of the company. "You're not getting any younger, Dad," Eric had said during what turned out to be our last family dinner together. "Maybe it's time to start transitioning leadership to the next generation." Richard had studied his son for a long moment before responding. "Are you asking me to retire?" "I'm suggesting that we plan for the inevitable. You've built something incredible, but legacies need stewards. I want to make sure Brahman Enterprises thrives for generations." "And you think you're ready for that responsibility?" "I know I am." The conversation had ended there, but I'd seen something shift in Richard's expression. For the first time, he was looking at Eric not as his beloved son, but as a potential threat to everything he'd built. Now, sitting in our bedroom the morning after his funeral, I understood what Richard had seen. Eric wasn't interested in preserving his father's legacy. He was interested in claiming his inheritance. And Vanessa wasn't just along for the ride. She was the driving force behind his transformation. My phone rang, interrupting my dark thoughts. Charles Whitmore's name appeared on the screen. "Charles, good morning." "Aisha, I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to see if we could move our meeting to this afternoon instead of Tuesday. There are some time-sensitive matters we should discuss." "Of course. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, but Richard left some very specific instructions about the timing of certain revelations. Can you come to my office around 2? "I'll be there." After I hung up, I found myself wondering what kind of specific instructions my husband had left. Richard had always been meticulous about planning, thinking several moves ahead in business and in life. Had he somehow anticipated the greed I'd witnessed in Eric and Vanessa? I spent the morning going through Richard's personal effects. His clothes, his jewelry, the small mementos he'd kept from his childhood and early business days. In his nightstand drawer, I found a sealed envelope with my name written in his careful handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 1 month before his death. "My dearest Aisha, if you're reading this, then my worst fears about my health have come to pass. I'm sorry I couldn't give us more time together. Every day with you has been a gift I never deserved. But I need you to know that I've been watching Eric carefully over the past 2 years, and I'm deeply concerned about the man he's becoming. The son we raised with such love and hope has been replaced by someone I barely recognize. Whether this is entirely Vanessa's influence or something that was always lurking beneath the surface, I can't say. But I can't ignore what I see. I've made arrangements to protect you and to teach Eric a lesson about entitlement versus earning. Charles has all the details. Trust him completely. He's been working on this with me for months. You are stronger than you know, more capable than Eric gives you credit for, and more deserving of respect than either he or Vanessa have shown you. Don't let grief make you forget your worth. I love you today, tomorrow, and always. Richard." I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring my vision. Even facing his own mortality, Richard had been thinking about protecting me, about ensuring that I wouldn't be left vulnerable to our son's greed. Whatever arrangements he'd made, whatever lessons he'd planned for Eric, I knew they would be both elegant and devastating. Richard never struck in anger. He struck with precision, patience, and perfect timing. As I prepared for my meeting with Charles, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day Richard died: anticipation. My husband had left me one final gift, and I couldn't wait to unwrap it. Eric and Vanessa thought they were in charge now. They had no idea what was coming. The plot is thickening, and I am here for it. Drop 100 points in the comments if you can already see where this is going, and hit that notification bell because next week we're finding out exactly what Richard planned. This is about to get good. Charles Whitmore's law office occupied the top 3 floors of downtown's most prestigious building. I'd been there countless times over the years for various business matters, but walking through those mahogany-paneled hallways on this particular afternoon felt different. Everything looked the same: the oil paintings of distinguished former partners, the Persian rugs, the leather-bound legal volumes. But I was different. Yesterday I'd been a wife. Today I was a widow with secrets to uncover. Charles greeted me personally, something he'd always done but which now felt especially significant. At 72, he moved with the careful dignity of a man who'd spent decades handling other people's most important decisions. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit immaculate, his handshake firm and reassuring. "Aisha, thank you for coming so quickly. Please, let's go to my private office." He led me past the reception area to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city Richard had helped shape. The walls were lined with photographs of Charles with various clients and dignitaries, including several of him and Richard at groundbreaking ceremonies and charity events spanning over 2 decades. "Would you care for coffee?" "Water." "Coffee would be lovely, thank you." As Charles prepared our drinks from an expensive machine that probably cost more than most people's cars, I studied his expression. There was something almost excited in his demeanor, like a man who'd been keeping a delicious secret and was finally allowed to share it. "Charles," I said as he handed me a perfect cup of coffee, "Richard's letter mentioned that he'd been working with you on some arrangements. What exactly did my husband plan?" Charles settled behind his massive oak desk and pulled out a thick folder marked with Richard's name. "Aisha, what I'm about to tell you must remain absolutely confidential until the official reading next week." Richard was very specific about the timing. "Of course. Your husband came to me 10 months ago with some concerns about Eric's behavior. He'd noticed changes: the way Eric talked about money, his expectations about inheritance, his attitude toward you. Richard was particularly troubled by Vanessa's influence and what he saw as Eric's growing entitlement." I nodded, remembering the subtle shifts I'd witnessed myself. Richard asked me to help him create what we called a teaching moment. He wanted to ensure that Eric learned the difference between earning something and expecting it to be handed to him. Charles opened the folder and pulled out several documents. The will that Eric believes exists, the one Richard discussed with him during their business meetings about succession planning, was never Richard's actual final will. My coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. "What do you mean?" "The document Eric has heard referenced, the one that would have made him the primary heir to Brahman Enterprises, was essentially a draft that Richard allowed Eric to believe was final. Richard's actual will, the one that will be read next week, is quite different." "How different?" Charles smiled, and for the first time since Richard's death, I felt a flutter of genuine anticipation. Eric will inherit exactly $1, along with a letter explaining why. The bulk of Richard's estate, the $55 million, the companies, the properties, everything, goes to you. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands. "Charles, that's incredible. But Eric is his son." "Surely." Richard was very clear about his reasoning. He said that Eric had demonstrated over the past 2 years that he valued wealth over family, inheritance over achievement. Richard wanted to give him the opportunity to prove himself worthy of the family legacy through his own efforts, not through birthright. And if Eric contests the will? He can try, but Richard was brilliant about this. The will is ironclad: multiple witnesses, psychological evaluations proving Richard's sound mind, documentation of his concerns about Eric's character. More importantly, Richard documented every instance of Eric's entitled behavior over the past 18 months. Charles pulled out another folder, this one even thicker. Richard kept detailed records. Eric's comments about expecting his inheritance, his suggestions that Richard should retire and hand over control, his lack of respect for your contributions to the business. Richard even made some recordings. Recordings? Richard began using a small recording device during family dinners and business meetings after his diagnosis. He captured Eric saying some illuminating things about his plans for the estate and his assumptions about your role in managing it. I felt a mixture of sadness and vindication. My husband had seen the same troubling changes in our son that I had, but he'd been methodical about documenting them. There's more, Charles continued. Richard also arranged for the transfer of several key assets into offshore accounts and trusts that will be completely under your control. The house, the art collection, the yacht, the vacation properties, they're all legally yours as of yesterday. But how? Eric and Vanessa will know something's wrong when they realize they can't access anything. That's the beauty of Richard's plan. For the next week, until the will reading, everything appears normal. The accounts are still accessible for routine matters. The properties are still in the family name. Eric and Vanessa won't realize anything fundamental has changed until I read the will publicly. Charles leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying this part. Richard predicted that Eric would likely begin making plans and possibly even financial commitments immediately after the funeral, assuming he had access to unlimited resources. Every assumption he makes now, every plan he develops based on wealth he'll never inherit, will make the lesson more definitive. That's diabolical. That's Richard. He always said the best business lessons were learned through consequences, not lectures. I thought about my son's arrogance, his casual dismissal of my intelligence, his wife's entitled attitude. The idea of them making grand plans based on wealth they would never inherit filled me with a satisfaction I probably shouldn't have felt. What happens after the will reading? That depends on how Eric and Vanessa react. If they accept the situation gracefully and Eric demonstrates genuine remorse for his behavior, you'll have complete discretion about how much support to provide. If they fight it, Charles shrugged. Well, Richard made sure you'd have the resources and documentation to defend yourself. And the business? Brahman Enterprises? Yours completely. Richard restructured everything over the past 6 months. You're now the sole owner of a company worth approximately $35 million, with full authority to make decisions about management and succession. The implications were staggering. Not only would I inherit everything, but I would have complete control over Eric's professional future. If he wanted to continue working for Brahman Enterprises, he would have to answer to me. Charles, this is overwhelming. I never expected. Richard knew you'd feel that way. He left you another letter, to be opened only after you'd learned about the will. Charles handed me a second envelope, sealed with red wax and marked for Aisha's eyes only, after the revelation. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling slightly. My darling wife. By now Charles has explained the arrangements I've made. I know this feels like an enormous responsibility, and I know you're probably feeling conflicted about Eric's inheritance. Don't. You've earned every dollar of this fortune through your support, your intelligence, your social grace, and your unwavering loyalty. You've been my partner in every meaningful sense, and you deserve to control what we built together. As for Eric, I'm not punishing him out of spite. I'm giving him the greatest gift I can, the opportunity to prove he's worthy of the Brahman name through his own efforts rather than his birthright. If he's truly the man we raised him to be, he'll understand eventually. If he's not, well, then we'll know who he really is. You are brilliant, capable, and stronger than our son gives you credit for. Trust yourself. Make decisions based on what's right, not what's easy. And remember that love sometimes requires tough choices. Use this opportunity to build the life you want, free from the expectations of others. You've earned that freedom. Forever yours, Richard. I folded the letter carefully, feeling a complex mixture of grief, gratitude, and determination. Richard had not only protected me financially, he'd given me the tools to protect myself from our son's greed and entitlement. There's one more thing, Charles said quietly. Richard asked me to suggest that you might want to observe Eric and Vanessa's behavior over the next week before deciding how to handle the aftermath of the will reading. What do you mean? Let them think they've won. Watch how they treat you when they believe you're at their mercy. See what they do with what they think is their newfound power. Richard believed that people's true character emerges when they think they have nothing to lose and everything to gain. The idea was both terrifying and thrilling. For a week, I would have to play the role of the helpless widow while Eric and Vanessa revealed their true selves. But I would do it knowing that I held all the cards, that every moment of their arrogance was building toward their ultimate humiliation. Will you do it? Charles asked. I thought about Eric's words at the funeral. Don't expect a dime from Dad's $55 million. I thought about Vanessa's declaration that they were in charge now. I thought about years of subtle disrespect, condescension, and greed disguised as concern for my well-being. Oh, yes, I said, feeling a smile play at the corners of my mouth. I'll do it. But Charles, when this is over, I want Eric to understand exactly how completely he underestimated me. That, Charles said with obvious satisfaction, is exactly what Richard hoped you'd say. As I left Charles's office that afternoon, I felt more alive than I had in years. For the next week, I would be an actress playing the greatest role of my life. The grieving, helpless widow who needed her son's guidance and protection. But underneath the performance, I would be watching, learning, and preparing for the moment when Eric and Vanessa discovered that they had been playing checkers while I was playing chess. The game was about to begin, and thanks to my brilliant husband, I was already several moves ahead. Aisha is about to serve up some Oscar-worthy acting, and I am living for this setup. Drop a fire if you think Richard's plan is genius, and make sure you're subscribed because next week we're watching Eric and Vanessa reveal their true colors. The morning after my meeting with Charles, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and prepared to give the performance of my life. Gone was the composed, dignified woman who had handled her husband's funeral with such grace. Today, I needed to become someone smaller, more vulnerable, the kind of woman who might need her son's guidance to navigate the complexities of widowhood. I chose my outfit carefully, a simple black dress that was elegant but not striking, minimal jewelry, and just enough makeup to look presentable without appearing too put together. I needed to look like someone who was struggling with grief and uncertainty, not like someone who had just learned she'd inherited $55 million. Eric called just as I was finishing my coffee. Mom, how are you feeling this morning? Oh, one day at a time. I let my voice carry just a hint of tremor. Everything feels so overwhelming. That's completely understandable. Listen, Vanessa and I were thinking we should come over this afternoon to help you start sorting through some of Dad's things. And maybe we could talk about practical matters. Practical matters. Code for, let's discuss how much money we're about to inherit. That would be wonderful, sweetheart. I've been staring at your father's desk all morning, not knowing where to begin. There are so many papers, so many accounts I don't understand. Don't worry about any of that. Vanessa's really good with financial stuff. She can help you make sense of everything. The irony was delicious. Vanessa, who had quit her job after marrying Eric and hadn't worked in 4 years, was going to help me understand finances. Me, the woman who had been Richard's business partner and was now the sole owner of a multi-million-dollar empire. That's so thoughtful of you both. I honestly don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out, Mom. We're family. After I hung up, I spent an hour carefully arranging Richard's study to look like I'd been attempting to organize his papers, but had become overwhelmed by the task. I scattered documents across his desk, left file drawers half open, and placed a box of tissues prominently on the side table. The scene needed to suggest a woman who had tried to tackle her husband's affairs, but had quickly realized she was in over her head. Eric and Vanessa arrived at 2 o'clock sharp, both dressed casually but expensively. Eric wore designer jeans and a cashmere sweater I remembered giving him for Christmas 3 years ago. Vanessa looked like she was heading to a country club lunch. Designer jeans, silk blouse, jewelry that caught the afternoon light streaming through our windows. "Mom, you look tired," Eric said, embracing me with what seemed like genuine concern. "Are you sleeping okay?" "Not really. The house feels so empty without your father. And I keep thinking about all the things I need to handle, all the decisions I need to make." I gestured helplessly toward Richard's study. "I tried to start going through his papers this morning, but it's all so complicated." Vanessa's eyes lit up with what she probably thought was sympathetic interest. "Oh, Aisha, you shouldn't be dealing with that alone. Financial matters can be so stressful, especially when you're grieving. I just feel so lost. Your father handled everything. I don't even know where to begin." "Well, that's why we're here," Eric said, already moving toward the study. "Dad always said family takes care of family." I followed them into Richard's office, watching as their eyes swept over the deliberately chaotic scene I'd created. Eric went straight to the desk, his fingers hovering over the papers I'd scattered there. "Mom, have you talked to Charles Whitmore yet? About the will?" "Briefly. He said we'd meet next week to go over everything formally. But Eric, I'm so worried about what I'm going to do. Your father never really explained the business side of things to me. I don't know how I'll manage all of this alone." The relief on their faces was almost comical. Vanessa actually smiled before catching herself and rearranging her expression into appropriate concern. "You won't be alone," Vanessa said, settling into the chair across from Richard's desk as if she belonged there. "We'll help you figure everything out." "Do you really think you could? I mean, I know you're both so busy with your own lives." "Mom, we're talking about family legacy here," Eric said, picking up one of the financial statements I'd left on top of the pile. "Dad built something incredible, and we need to make sure it's protected." "Protected from what?" Eric exchanged a glance with Vanessa before answering. "Well, from bad decisions. From people who might try to take advantage of your grief. From complications." "What kind of complications?" "Estate taxes, business management, investment decisions," Vanessa said smoothly. "There are a lot of vultures out there who prey on widows, especially wealthy ones. You need people you can trust to guide you." "People like you?" "Exactly like us," Eric said. "We know Dad's business, we understand the family finances, and we love you. Who better to help you navigate all of this?" I let my shoulders sag with apparent relief. I've been so worried about making the wrong choices. Your father always said I was too trusting, that I needed to be more careful about who I relied on. Dad was right about that, Vanessa said. But that's why you have Eric and me. We'll make sure no one takes advantage of you. The casual way she included herself in my family, as if she had any claim to Richard's legacy beyond her marriage to Eric, was breathtaking in its audacity. But I simply nodded gratefully. "I can't tell you how much better I feel knowing you'll help me. I was so afraid I'd mess everything up and disappoint your father's memory." "That's not going to happen," Eric said firmly. "We'll make sure Dad's legacy is protected and grows. In fact, I've already been thinking about some opportunities." "What kind of opportunities?" Eric's eyes took on the gleam I'd seen whenever he talked about his grand business plans. "Well, once we understand the full scope of the estate, there are some investments I've been researching. high-yield opportunities that could significantly multiply Dad's wealth. Isn't that risky? All good investments involve some risk, Mom. But I have connections to some luxury real estate developments that are going to explode in value. We could double the estate's worth in just a few years. Double it. I let my voice carry a note of awe. That sounds wonderful, but also terrifying. What if something goes wrong? Nothing's going to go wrong, Vanessa said confidently. Eric has incredible business instincts. He's been planning these moves for months. Months. So they've been counting Richard's money and planning how to spend it while he was still alive. The casual admission of their greed was almost impressive. I suppose. If you really think it's wise. Trust me, Mom. Dad would want us to be aggressive about growing his legacy, not just sitting on it earning minimal returns in boring old investments. I nodded uncertainly, playing the part of a woman who is grateful for guidance, but nervous about big decisions. Well, I certainly don't understand these things well enough to argue. I'll just have to trust your judgment. That's exactly right, Eric said, his confidence growing with every word. You focus on grieving and healing. Let us handle the business side. Speaking of which, Vanessa said, pulling out her phone, I've been looking at some investment properties online. There's a luxury condo development in Miami that's taking pre-orders. If we move quickly, we could secure the best units. How much would something like that cost? Only about $1.5 million for a premier unit, Eric said casually. It's a steal, really, considering the location and the projected appreciation. $1.5 million. They were already spending my money they didn't have and would never get, as if it were pocket change. $1.5 million, I repeated weakly. That's a lot of money. Mom, when you're dealing with Dad's level of wealth, $1.5 million is a reasonable investment, Eric said with a patronizing tone he'd been using more frequently lately. You have to think bigger picture. Small thinking leads to small results. I suppose you're right. I'm just not used to thinking in those numbers. You'll adjust, Vanessa said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It takes time to get comfortable with real wealth. But don't worry, we'll guide you through it. We spent the next hour with Eric and Vanessa walking me through their various investment ideas, each more expensive and ambitious than the last. A yacht charter business that would require a $3 million initial investment. A restaurant franchise that needed $5 million in startup capital. A tech company that was revolutionizing social media and would cost $8 million to get in on the ground floor. By the end of the afternoon, they had theoretically spent nearly $20 million of what they thought was their inheritance. This is all so exciting, I said as they prepared to leave. I never realized there were so many opportunities out there. That's because Dad was conservative in his thinking, Eric said. He did great for his generation, but our generation thinks differently about wealth and risk. I'm just so grateful you're willing to take this on. I don't know what I would have done without you. You'll never have to find out, Vanessa said, leaning down to hug me. We're going to take such good care of you and the estate. Richard would be so proud. After they left, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Richard's study, laughing until tears ran down my cheeks. In the space of 3 hours, Eric and Vanessa had revealed themselves completely. They saw me as a helpless, bumbling widow who needed their guidance to avoid making terrible financial decisions. Meanwhile, they were planning to gamble away a significant portion of the inheritance on risky investments and luxury purchases. The beautiful irony was that while they thought they were protecting the estate from my poor judgment, they were actually revealing their own complete lack of wisdom and restraint. Every grandiose plan they'd shared with me was evidence of their unfitness to manage serious wealth. My phone rang as I was finishing my wine. Charles Whitmore's name appeared on the screen. Charles, perfect timing. I just had the most illuminating afternoon. Oh, how did our budding heirs handle their first taste of perceived power? They spent $20 million in theoretical investments and treated me like I was a senile child who needed their protection from the complexities of finance. Charles chuckled. Richard predicted they would overplay their hand. Did they mention any specific plans? Luxury real estate in Miami, restaurant franchises, tech startups, yacht businesses. Eric seems to think he's going to double the estate's value through aggressive investments. With what money?
Exactly.
They're so confident about their inheritance that they're already spending it in their minds. Eric even mentioned having connections to these deals. That's interesting, and probably indicates he's been planning this for longer than we thought. There's something else, Charles. The casual way they discussed protecting me from people who might take advantage of my grief. While they were literally planning to take advantage of my grief. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. That's the most valuable evidence of all, Aisha. They've shown you exactly who they are when they think they hold all the power. How did it feel, playing the helpless widow? I considered the question seriously. Liberating, actually. There's something freeing about letting people underestimate you so completely. Every patronizing comment, every assumption about my intelligence, every casual dismissal of my capabilities, it all just makes what's coming so much sweeter. And what is coming? A lesson in humility that Eric and Vanessa will never forget. They think they're about to become the king and queen of a $55 million empire. Instead, they're about to discover that their kingdom was built on sand. Any regrets? I thought about my son, the little boy who used to bring me flowers and tell me I was the most beautiful woman in the world. But that child was gone, replaced by a man who saw his mother as an obstacle to wealth rather than the woman who'd loved him unconditionally for 38 years. No regrets, I said firmly. Eric and Vanessa have shown me their true colors. They've chosen greed over family, entitlement over respect, manipulation over love. This is what they deserve. Then you're ready for the will reading? When is it scheduled? Next Friday at 10 a.m. I'll notify Eric and Vanessa tomorrow about the time and location. 1 week from today. Perfect. After I hung up with Charles, I walked through my house with new eyes. Every room, every piece of furniture, every work of art was now legally mine. The Persian rugs Eric and Vanessa had walked across while planning to spend my money, the crystal chandelier they'd stood under while discussing my supposed incompetence, the mahogany dining table where they'd eaten countless meals funded by the wealth they were now trying to claim. All of it was mine. The business, the properties, the investments, the bank accounts, everything Richard and I had built together was now under my control. But more than that, I had something Eric and Vanessa didn't even realize they'd given me. Complete clarity about who they really were. They'd torn off their masks so completely that I could never again doubt that my husband's harsh lesson was exactly what they deserved. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for them to walk into it. Eric's already spending millions he'll never have. Drop a heart if you're ready to watch this empire of greed crumble, and don't forget to subscribe because next week we're seeing just how deep Eric will dig his own theoretical grave. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Richard's death. Today marked the beginning of what I privately thought of as the observation period. 6 days of watching Eric and Vanessa make increasingly presumptuous plans while I position myself as the gracious widow who is simply following her son's wise guidance. But first, I had some social groundwork to lay. I called Margaret Worthington before 9 a.m., knowing she'd be having her coffee and reading the society pages, her daily ritual for the past 20 years. Margaret, darling, it's Aisha. I hope I'm not calling too early. Never too early for you, sweetheart. How are you holding up? Some days are better than others. Actually, I was hoping I could ask your advice about something. Margaret's voice immediately sharpened with interest. In our social circle, being asked for advice was both an honor and a responsibility. Of course, dear. What's troubling you? It's about Eric and Vanessa. They've been so wonderful, offering to help me navigate Richard's business affairs. But I'm worried I might be leaning on them too heavily. I don't want to be a burden. Oh, Aisha, you could never be a burden. But it's thoughtful of you to be concerned. What kind of help are they offering? Financial guidance, mostly. Investment advice. They seem to have such innovative ideas about growing wealth, but I confess I don't understand half of what they're suggesting. Margaret's tone carried just the right note of caution. Innovation can be wonderful, but it can also be risky. Richard was always so careful about his investments. That's exactly what I'm thinking. But Eric seems so confident, and Vanessa has such strong opinions about modern investment strategies. I don't want to seem old-fashioned or resistant to change. Aisha, dear, there's nothing old-fashioned about prudence. Some of us remember what happened to the Pemberton fortune when young James decided to modernize his father's conservative portfolio. I did remember. James Pemberton had lost 60% of his inheritance in 3 years through aggressive tech investments and luxury real estate speculation. His family had never recovered their social standing. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. But I don't want to hurt Eric's feelings by questioning his judgment. Perhaps you should get a second opinion? Charles Whitmore has always been so reliable. Oh, I will definitely be consulting with Charles. I was just wondering, do you think it would be appropriate to discuss some of this at the charity luncheon tomorrow? Not gossip, of course, but perhaps some general advice about managing estates. Margaret understood immediately. The charity luncheon was attended by the city's most influential women, many of whom had experience managing significant wealth after the deaths of their husbands. If I raised concerns about overly aggressive investment strategies in that setting, word would spread quickly through our social network. I think that would be very appropriate. Eleanor Richardson went through something similar after her husband died, and Patricia Ashford has excellent experience with estate management. They'd both have valuable insights. Thank you, Margaret. You always know exactly what to say. That's what friends are for, darling. And Aisha? Don't let anyone pressure you into making decisions you're not comfortable with. Your instincts have always been excellent. After I hung up, I called 2 more influential women in our circle, having similar conversations with each. By the end of the morning, I'd planted seeds of concern about aggressive investment strategies and the pressure young heirs sometimes put on their grieving mothers. I'd positioned myself as the thoughtful widow seeking guidance, and Eric and Vanessa as the overeager children pushing risky financial schemes. The beauty of it was that I hadn't said anything untrue or overtly critical. I'd simply expressed the natural concerns of a woman who was worried about making the right decisions with her late husband's legacy. Around noon, Eric called with barely contained excitement. "Mom, great news! I spoke with the Miami real estate developer this morning. They're holding the premier unit for us, but we need to move quickly. The deposit is only $200,000, and they're offering special financing for the balance." My hand tightened on the phone. $200,000? That seems like a lot for a deposit. It's actually quite reasonable for a property of this caliber. And, Mom, the projected returns are incredible. We're talking about a property that could be worth $3 million in 5 years. $200,000. Money that Eric didn't actually have access to yet, but he was speaking as if the transaction was already approved. "Are you sure this is wise, sweetheart?" "Absolutely. In fact, I'm so confident about this that I'm thinking we should go bigger." The restaurant franchise I mentioned? I got a call back from their corporate office. They want to fast-track our application because they're impressed with our financial profile. What does that mean exactly? It means they're offering us 3 locations instead of 1. The investment would be larger, $15 million total, but the revenue potential is enormous. $15 million. Eric was casually discussing an investment that represented more than a quarter of the entire estate value. $15 million sounds like a lot of money, Eric. Mom, you have to stop thinking small. With Dad's wealth, 15 million is a significant but manageable investment. And the franchise potential is incredible. We're talking about building a regional empire. Our empire. Not his investment, but ours. Eric was already thinking of himself as the family patriarch, making decisions that would affect the entire estate. I suppose if you're certain, I am certain. In fact, Vanessa and I are meeting with their corporate team tomorrow to sign the preliminary agreements. They want to move quickly because they have other investors interested. Tomorrow? That seems very fast. That's how these opportunities work, Mom. You have to be decisive. Dad understood that. It's how he built his fortune. Quick decisions, calculated risks, aggressive growth strategies. The irony was breathtaking. Richard had built his fortune through careful planning, conservative investments, and methodical expansion over decades. Eric was describing the exact opposite approach and attributing it to his father. Well, I trust your judgment, sweetheart. You've clearly thought this through carefully. Exactly. And Mom, there's something else. Vanessa and I have been talking, and we think it might be time for you to start thinking about simplifying your living situation. Simplifying? The house is so big for just one person, and the maintenance costs must be enormous. We were thinking you might be happier in a nice condo somewhere. Maybe something in that new luxury development downtown? Much more manageable for someone in your position. Someone in my position. A widow who needed her son's guidance because she was incapable of managing a large home or significant wealth on her own. I hadn't really thought about moving. You don't have to decide anything right away. But the real estate market is hot right now, and the house would probably sell quickly for top dollar. The proceeds could fund some of our larger investment opportunities. The proceeds from selling my house, the home Richard and I had built together, filled with memories of our life, would fund Eric's risky business ventures. He was already mentally liquidating my entire existence to finance his get-rich-quick schemes. I'll think about it. Take your time. But Vanessa found this great realtor who specializes in luxury properties. She could come by next week just to give us an idea of the house's value. No commitment, just information. After Eric hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone. In the space of one conversation, my son had discussed spending $200,000 on a real estate deposit, committed to a $15 million restaurant franchise, and suggested that I sell my home to fund his entrepreneurial dreams. All of this while treating me like a child who needed protection from complex financial decisions. I called Charles immediately. Charles, Eric just discussed spending $200,000 on a Miami real estate deposit and committing to a $15 million restaurant investment. All within the last 24 hours. Interesting. He's moving faster than Richard anticipated. Has he actually committed any money yet? He's making plans as if he already has access to the funds. He's scheduled meetings tomorrow to sign preliminary agreements. Aisha, I need you to understand something. Eric can't actually access any estate funds until the will is probated and the inheritance is officially transferred. Every dollar he's planning to spend exists only in his imagination. Then how is he planning to cover these deposits and commitments? Either he's planning to use his personal funds, which are limited, or he's making promises based on money he expects to inherit but doesn't legally have yet. What happens if he signs agreements he can't honor? That depends on the specific contracts. But generally speaking, if someone commits to investments they can't fund, they could face breach of contract lawsuits, damage to their credit, and potentially even fraud charges if they misrepresented their financial situation. The magnitude of Eric's potential mistake was staggering. He was so confident about his inheritance that he was making commitments that could destroy him financially if he was wrong. Charles, is there any possibility he could actually access estate funds before the will reading? None whatsoever. Richard was very specific about the timing. Until the will is officially read and probated, Eric has no legal claim to any estate assets. Every plan he's making is based on assumptions, not legal reality. That afternoon, I attended the charity luncheon where several of the city's most prominent women gathered to discuss both philanthropy and, more importantly, the social dynamics of our community. I arrived looking appropriately subdued in a simple navy dress and minimal jewelry, the picture of a woman still deep in grief, but trying to maintain her social obligations. "Aisha, dear, how are you managing?" asked Eleanor Richardson, whose husband had died 7 years earlier, leaving her to navigate a similarly complex estate. "Some days are better than others," I replied honestly. "I'm trying to make sense of Richard's business affairs, but it's all so overwhelming." "Oh, I remember that feeling. The pressure to make important decisions when you're still grieving is terrible. Are you getting good advice?" Eric and Vanessa have been wonderful, offering to help with investment decisions. They have such modern ideas about wealth management, but I confess I'm more comfortable with Richard's conservative approach. "Conservative isn't a dirty word, dear," said Patricia Ashford, whose family had maintained their fortune for 4 generations through careful management. "There's something to be said for preserving wealth rather than constantly trying to multiply it." That's what I keep thinking. But Eric seems so confident about these new opportunities: Miami real estate, restaurant franchises, technology companies. He says I need to think bigger. The women exchanged meaningful glances. In our circle, everyone had heard stories about heirs who'd squandered their inheritances through overconfidence and poor judgment. "Aisha," Eleanor said carefully, "you know you don't have to make any major decisions immediately. Estate management can wait until you're emotionally ready to handle it." That's what I told Eric, but he seems to think speed is important. He says opportunities won't wait. "Opportunities never seem to wait," Patricia observed dryly. "That's usually the first sign that they're not as good as they appear." By the end of the afternoon, I'd accomplished exactly what I'd hoped. Word would spread through our social network that Eric was pressuring his grieving mother to make risky financial decisions quickly, without giving her time to process her loss or seek proper counsel. When the truth about the inheritance came out, public opinion would already be positioned against him. That evening, I walked through my house thinking about the week ahead. 6 more days of watching Eric and Vanessa dig themselves deeper into a hole of their own making. 6 more days of being underestimated and condescended to by people who had no idea they were playing a game they'd already lost. The will reading was scheduled for Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, Eric and Vanessa would discover that all their planning had been built on a foundation of false assumptions. I was ready for that moment. More than ready, I was eager for it. Eric's building his empire on quicksand and doesn't even know it. Drop a muscle emoji if you can't wait to see it all come crashing down, and hit that subscribe button, because next week we're watching the final preparations for the greatest reveal in inheritance history. 4 days before the will reading, Charles called me at 7 in the morning. "Aisha, we need to meet." Eric's activities over the past week have created a paper trail that's extensive. How extensive? Extensive enough that I need to show you the documentation in person. "Can you come to my office this morning?" An hour later, I sat in Charles's office staring at a stack of documents that chronicled my son's spectacular descent into financial fantasy. Charles had organized the papers like evidence in a legal case, each one more revealing than the last. "Let's start with what we know for certain," Charles said, settling behind his desk with the grim expression of a doctor delivering a serious diagnosis. "The Miami condo. Eric has signed a letter of intent and provided personal financial information claiming liquid assets of $55 million. He doesn't have $55 million. Correct. He's essentially committed fraud by misrepresenting his financial situation to secure this opportunity." Charles pulled out another document. "The restaurant franchise. He signed preliminary agreements for 3 locations with a total investment commitment of $15 million. $15 million that he doesn't have. Right again. But it gets more complicated. The franchise company has done preliminary approval based on his financial representations. If he can't produce the funds by next Friday, the day after the will reading, he'll be in breach of contract. Charles pulled out more papers. Yesterday, he also put earnest money down on a warehouse property for $2.8 million, which he plans to convert into luxury lofts. And he's committed to investing in a tech startup. Minimum investment of $5 million. The numbers were staggering. How much in total? Over the past week, Eric has committed to spending approximately $23 million. That's nearly half the estate value. How is he funding any of this? He's not. He's making commitments based entirely on his expected inheritance. Every contract he's signed includes representations about his liquid assets and investment capacity that are completely false. Charles opened his laptop and showed me a spreadsheet. Richard set up monitoring on all of Eric's financial accounts. His actual liquid assets are approximately $80,000, his savings account, and some stock options from the company. $80,000 versus the $55 million he's claiming?
Exactly.
Aisha, your son isn't just making poor investment decisions. He's committing fraud by misrepresenting his financial situation to secure these opportunities. The legal implications were beginning to sink in. Eric wasn't just going to be disappointed about his inheritance. He was going to face potential criminal charges for obtaining contracts under false pretenses. There's more, Charles continued. Vanessa has been equally busy. She's ordered a custom Mercedes, $150,000. She's hired an interior designer to renovate their apartment at a cost of $200,000. And she's made deposits on jewelry and clothing totaling $85,000. All based on money they don't have. All based on money they'll never have. But, Aisha, the most concerning development happened yesterday evening. Charles turned his laptop screen toward me, showing what appeared to be a real estate listing. Eric contacted a realtor about listing your house. He told her he was handling your affairs and wanted to discuss a quick sale to take advantage of the current market. My blood ran cold. He did what? The realtor, fortunately, knows our family and called me immediately. She was concerned about Eric making decisions about your property without your direct involvement or proper legal authorization. Did he actually sign anything? No, but he scheduled a meeting with her this afternoon to discuss marketing strategies. He told her you were eager to downsize and wanted to move quickly while the market was strong. The audacity was breathtaking. Eric was not only spending money he didn't have, but also trying to sell property that wasn't his to liquidate. Charles, what happens when the will is read and Eric realizes he's not inheriting anything? Legally, he'll be personally liable for every commitment he's made and every misrepresentation he's provided. The contract parties will demand immediate payment or performance. If he can't deliver, they'll pursue legal remedies. And if he can't pay, bankruptcy would be the best-case scenario. Worst case? Criminal fraud charges for obtaining contracts through false representations. His reputation and professional standing would be destroyed. Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression mixing sympathy with satisfaction. Richard designed this lesson to be comprehensive. Eric won't just lose his expected inheritance. He'll lose everything he actually owns plus face legal consequences for his deception. I thought about my son, the little boy who'd once been so honest he'd confess to breaking things even when no one suspected him. Somewhere along the way, that honest child had become a man who would lie about having $55 million to secure business deals. Is there any way to stop this? To warn him before it's too late. Charles studied my face carefully. Do you want to warn him? It was a fair question. Did I want to save Eric from the consequences of his own dishonesty and greed? Did maternal love require me to rescue him from a disaster of his own making? I thought about his words at the funeral. Don't expect a dime from Dad's $55 million. I thought about Vanessa's declaration that they were in charge now. I thought about their casual dismissal of my intelligence, their assumption that I needed their guidance to avoid making poor financial decisions. No, I said finally. Eric has made his choices based on his own assumptions and entitlement. He's an adult who should understand the risks of misrepresenting his financial situation. And Vanessa? Vanessa married Eric for his expected wealth, not for love. She's encouraged every reckless decision he's made because she thought it would benefit her. They deserve each other. Charles nodded approvingly. Then we proceed as planned. The will reading is scheduled for 10 a.m. on Friday. I'll confirm the time and location with Eric and Vanessa today. Will anyone else be there? Just us, Eric, Vanessa, and my associate who'll serve as a witness. Richard wanted this to be intimate, no audience for the revelation except the people directly affected. As I prepared to leave Charles's office, he handed me one final document. Richard's last instructions for you. He wanted you to read this the night before the will reading. The envelope was sealed with wax and marked for Aisha, Thursday night only. I slipped it into my purse, knowing that whatever it contained would either strengthen my resolve or shake it to its foundation. That afternoon, Eric called with his familiar excitement. Mom, incredible news. The restaurant franchise corporate office loved our financial profile. We're approved for all 3 locations, and they want to move on the funding immediately. That's wonderful, sweetheart. The words felt hollow knowing what I knew about his actual financial situation. And the tech startup? They're so impressed with our investment capacity that they're offering us a board position. Can you imagine? We'll be part of the decision-making process for what could be the next major breakthrough in social media. The fantasy was complete. Eric had convinced himself that he wasn't just inheriting money, but inheriting a position of influence and respect in the business world. He saw himself as a serious investor, a decision-maker, a man whose opinions would matter in boardrooms and strategy meetings. You seem to have everything so well planned. That's the key, Mom. Dad always said success comes from planning ahead, and that's exactly what we're doing. By the time the estate is officially settled, we'll already have our investment portfolio optimized and our business ventures launched. And if something goes wrong, nothing's going to go wrong. Mom, I have insider knowledge on all of these deals. These aren't random investments. They're carefully researched opportunities with proven track records. Insider knowledge. Proven track records. Eric was not just making poor financial decisions. He was basing them on complete misunderstandings about how legitimate business actually worked. Well, I certainly don't understand these things well enough to question your judgment.
Exactly.
That's why you're lucky to have us handling this. Vanessa and I have been studying investment strategies for months, preparing for this moment. You can just focus on healing and let us manage the wealth building. After Eric hung up, I called Margaret Worthington for a final round of social preparation. Margaret, I need your advice about something delicate. Of course, dear. What's troubling you? I'm worried that Eric might be moving too aggressively with some investment decisions. He's discussing amounts that seem very large for someone who hasn't actually inherited anything yet. What kinds of amounts?
Millions, Margaret.
Multiple millions across various projects he's convinced will generate enormous returns. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Aisha, has Eric actually inherited anything yet? I thought Richard's will hadn't been read. It hasn't. That's happening Friday. But Eric seems to be making financial commitments based on his expectations about the inheritance. Oh my. Margaret's voice carried the tone of someone who'd seen this story before and knew how it ended. That's very concerning. I've tried to suggest that he might want to wait until things are official, but he says opportunities won't wait. He seems so certain about everything. Certainty can be dangerous when it's based on assumptions rather than facts. By the end of our conversation, Margaret understood the situation perfectly. Eric was making large financial commitments based on an inheritance he hadn't actually received yet. When word of this spread through our social circle, which it would, by tomorrow, Eric's reputation would already be damaged before the will reading even took place. That evening, I sat in Richard's study with a glass of wine, thinking about the week ahead. Tomorrow would bring the moment of truth, the revelation that would destroy Eric and Vanessa's dreams and expose their greed and dishonesty to the world. I was ready for that moment. After a week of watching them treat me like an incompetent child while they planned to spend money they didn't have on dreams they'd never achieve, I was more than ready. The paper trail Charles had shown me proved that Eric and Vanessa weren't just greedy, they were dishonest. They'd lied about their financial situation to secure business opportunities, committed to investments they couldn't fund, and planned to liquidate my home to cover their schemes. Tomorrow, they would discover that every plan they'd made, every commitment they'd signed, every lie they'd told was about to collapse around them. And I would be watching when it happened. The evidence is damning, and Eric's about to learn that contracts based on lies have consequences. Drop a jury emoji if you think he deserves what's coming, and make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow is Judgment Day. Friday morning arrived gray and overcast, with autumn clouds threatening rain. I dressed carefully in a black Armani suit, elegant but understated, appropriate for the widow of a successful businessman. My jewelry was minimal. Richard's wedding ring on a chain around my neck, small pearl earrings, and my engagement ring, which I'd moved to my right hand after the funeral. I wanted to look dignified but vulnerable, like a woman who is still processing her grief and relying on others to guide her through complex legal matters. Charles's office building looked imposing under the threatening sky, its glass and steel facade reflecting the gray clouds like a mirror. I arrived 15 minutes early and spent the time in my car, watching Eric and Vanessa pull up in what appeared to be a new BMW. Apparently, they decided to upgrade their transportation in anticipation of their windfall. Eric looked excited, practically bouncing as he walked toward the building. He wore his best suit and a tie I'd given him for his birthday 2 years ago, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man about to claim his kingdom. Vanessa was equally animated, her designer dress and perfectly styled hair suggesting someone preparing for a celebration rather than a legal proceeding. They had no idea what was waiting for them. I entered the building a few minutes after them, riding the elevator to Charles's floor while rehearsing my role one final time. I needed to appear appropriately subdued, perhaps a little confused by legal terminology, grateful for my son's presence and support. The receptionist led me to Charles's main conference room, where Eric and Vanessa were already seated at the polished mahogany table. Eric jumped up to embrace me as I entered. "Mom, how are you feeling? I know this must be emotional."
I'm managing, sweetheart.
"Thank you for being here. I don't know what I'd do without your support." Vanessa offered me a sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're here for you, Aisha. Whatever the will says, we'll figure everything out together." Charles entered with his associate, both men carrying leather portfolios that contained the documents that would change all our lives. Charles looked solemn and professional, giving no hint of the bombshell he was about to detonate. "Thank you all for coming," Charles began, settling at the head of the table. "Before we begin, I want to explain the process. I'll read the will in its entirety, then answer any questions you might have about its provisions. The document has been properly witnessed and notarized, and all legal requirements have been met." Eric nodded eagerly. "We understand. Please go ahead." Charles opened the leather portfolio and removed a thick document bound in blue legal backing. "This is the last will and testament of Richard James Brahman, executed on September 20th of this year." September 20th. Just 6 weeks before Richard's death. The timing wasn't lost on me. He'd finalized these arrangements after his heart diagnosis. after watching Eric's behavior during his illness, after making his final assessment of our son's character. I'll begin with the preliminary statements and then move to the specific bequests, Charles continued. Richard's words as written. I, Richard James Brahman, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my final will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. Eric leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on Charles's words. First, I want to express my profound love for my wife, Aisha, who has been my partner, my advisor, and my greatest treasure for 32 years. Everything I built with her support, her wisdom, and her unwavering dedication to our family and our shared dreams. I felt tears prick my eyes at Richard's words, and I saw Eric smile slightly at what he probably interpreted as a touching but irrelevant sentiment before the real business began. Second, I want to acknowledge my son, Eric, who has shown me much about the difference between earning something and expecting it, between building a legacy and inheriting one. Eric's smile faltered slightly at the subtle edge in those words, but he maintained his confident expression. Charles continued reading the preliminary statements, then paused before moving to the heart of the document. Now, the specific bequests. To my beloved wife, Aisha Brahman, I leave the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to all real property, all business interests, all investment accounts, all personal property, and all liquid assets. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Eric's face went blank with confusion, and Vanessa's mouth opened slightly in shock. This includes full ownership of Brahman Enterprises, all subsidiary companies, the family residence, all vacation properties, all vehicles, all art and collectibles, and all bank accounts, investment portfolios, and retirement funds. Wait, Eric said, his voice tight with disbelief. What about? I mean, what's left for? Charles looked up from the document. I'm not finished reading, Eric. Please let me continue. To my son, Eric Brahman, I leave the sum of $1 to be paid from petty cash. The silence that followed was deafening. Eric stared at Charles as if he'd spoken in a foreign language, while Vanessa's face cycled through confusion, shock, and dawning horror. $1? Eric's voice cracked slightly. That's not possible. Dad promised me. We discussed. There's more, Charles said quietly, and continued reading. I make this bequest to Eric not out of cruelty, but out of love. For the past 2 years, I have watched my son demonstrate that he values inheritance over achievement, entitlement over effort, and wealth over wisdom. I have seen him treat his mother, my beloved partner, with disrespect and condescension, assuming that her grief would make her vulnerable to manipulation. Eric shot to his feet. This is insane. He can't have written this. Someone influenced him. Someone changed his mind. Eric, Charles said sharply, sit down and let me finish reading your father's words. Eric sank back into his chair, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. I leave Eric $1 as a reminder that love must be earned, respect must be demonstrated, and family loyalty is a two-way street. If my son wishes to build wealth, he can do so as I did, through hard work, smart decisions, and personal sacrifice. If he wishes to earn a place in our family legacy, he can prove himself worthy through his actions, not his birthright. Vanessa's perfectly composed facade finally cracked. This is impossible. Aisha, you have to contest this. Richard wasn't thinking clearly. Actually, Charles interrupted, Richard underwent a complete psychological evaluation 1 week before signing this will. The results showed him to be of completely sound mind, fully aware of his decisions, and acting without any undue influence. He pulled out another document. Furthermore, Richard specifically anticipated that this will might be contested. He prepared a detailed explanation of his reasoning, supported by documentation of Eric's behavior over the past 18 months. Eric found his voice again, though it came out as more of a croak. What kind of documentation? Charles's expression remained professionally neutral. Recordings of conversations where you discussed your inheritance expectations, copies of financial commitments you've made based on anticipated wealth, and testimony from multiple witnesses about your treatment of your mother during Richard's illness and after his death. The blood drained from Eric's face as he realized the implications. Not only had he failed to inherit anything, but his father had been documenting his greed and entitlement for months. "This can't be legal," Vanessa said desperately. "There have to be laws about disinheriting children. In this state, parents have complete discretion over their estate distribution," Charles replied calmly. "Richard's will is entirely legal and virtually uncontestable." I watched my son process the reality of his situation. In the space of 5 minutes, he'd gone from expecting to inherit $55 million to inheriting $1. But more than that, he was realizing that his father had seen through his facade completely, had recognized his greed and entitlement, and had chosen to teach him a lesson that would define the rest of his life. "Mom," Eric turned to me, his voice desperate. "You can change this. You inherited everything. You can give me what Dad should have left me. You can fix this." The moment I'd been dreading and anticipating had arrived. Eric was looking at me with the expectation that I would rescue him from the consequences of his own behavior, that maternal love would override judgment and justice. I looked at my son. This man who had dismissed my intelligence, planned to sell my home without my consent, committed fraud by misrepresenting his financial situation, and treated me like an incompetent child who needed his guidance. I thought about Richard's letter, about the choice between mercy and justice. "Eric," I said quietly, "your father's will reflects his assessment of your character and your recent behavior. I don't think I should override his judgment." "What?" Eric's voice was raw with disbelief. "Mom, I'm your son. I'm your only child. You can't seriously be considering leaving me with nothing. You're not being left with nothing. You're being left with the opportunity to prove yourself worthy of respect through your own efforts rather than your birthright." Vanessa leaned across the table, her mask of concern finally dropping to reveal the calculation beneath. "Aisha, you need to think about this carefully. Eric is your family. Blood is thicker than water." "Vanessa," I said with a calm I didn't entirely feel, "over the past week, you've made it very clear that you and Eric consider yourselves to be in charge of this family's wealth. You've planned how to spend this inheritance, how to grow it, how to use it to fund your dreams. You've treated me like an obstacle to your wealth rather than the woman who helped build it." "That's not true." "It's completely true. You've dismissed my intelligence, questioned my judgment, and assumed that grief would make me malleable to your manipulation. You've even had Eric contact realtors about selling my home to fund his investment schemes." Eric's face went through a series of expressions as he realized how completely his behavior had been observed and documented. "Mom, if we said things that hurt you, we're sorry. We were just trying to help." "You were trying to help yourselves," I said firmly. "And now you can continue helping yourselves, but with your own resources instead of mine." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Vanessa beginning to cry, not the delicate tears of grief, but the harsh sobs of someone watching their dreams disintegrate in real time. "Charles," Eric said desperately, "there has to be something we can do. Some way to challenge this." "Eric, you can certainly hire an attorney and attempt to contest the will. But I should warn you that doing so will trigger the release of all the documentation your father compiled about your behavior. The recordings, the financial records, the witness testimony, all of it will become part of the public record." The threat was clear. Eric could fight the will, but doing so would expose his greed, entitlement, and recent dishonesty to public scrutiny. In our social circle, where reputation was everything, such a revelation would be devastating. How long do I have to decide? Eric asked. 30 days from today to file any contest. But Eric, there's something else you should know. Your father was aware that you might make financial commitments in anticipation of your inheritance. All of your recent agreements, the Miami condo, the restaurant franchise, the warehouse property, the tech startup, all of those obligations remain your personal responsibility. Eric's face went ashen as the full scope of his situation became clear. Not only had he failed to inherit the money he'd been counting on, but he was personally liable for over $20 million in commitments he'd made based on wealth he would never receive. I don't understand, Vanessa whispered. How are we supposed to pay for everything? The restaurant investments, the real estate commitments, the loans we've taken? That, Charles said with ruthless precision, is no longer the estate's concern. Those were personal decisions made by adults who chose to make financial commitments based on assumptions rather than legal guarantees. As the full implications of their situation sank in, I watched Eric and Vanessa's relationship dynamics shift in real time. The confidence and partnership they'd shown while planning to spend my inheritance evaporated, replaced by panic and the beginning of blame. Eric, Vanessa said, her voice sharp with accusation, you told me the inheritance was guaranteed. You said your father had promised you everything. He did. He discussed succession planning with me. He talked about me taking over the business. Apparently, he changed his mind, I said quietly. And now you'll need to figure out how to handle your obligations without the safety net you were expecting. Eric turned to me one final time, his expression a mixture of desperation and dawning anger. Mom, please. I'm begging you. Don't let Dad's decision destroy our entire family. Eric, your father wasn't trying to destroy our family. He was trying to save it. And so am I. I stood up, gathering my purse with as much dignity as I could muster. Charles, thank you for handling this so professionally. I assume there are additional papers I'll need to sign. We can schedule a follow-up meeting next week to handle the estate transfer details. As I moved toward the door, Eric called after me.
Mom, wait. We need to talk about this.
We need to figure out how to move forward. I paused at the doorway and looked back at my son, this man who had valued money over family, inheritance over love, entitlement over respect. Eric, your father gave you exactly what you earned. I suggest you think carefully about what you want to earn from me going forward. And with that, I walked out of the conference room, leaving Eric and Vanessa to confront the ruins of their empire of greed. I made it to my car before the trembling started. Sitting in the parking garage beneath Charles's building, I gripped the steering wheel and tried to process what had just happened. In the space of 30 minutes, I had watched my son's entire world collapse. The confident, entitled man who had walked into that conference room expecting to claim a $55 million inheritance had left with $1 and the crushing weight of over $20 million in commitments he could never honor. Part of me, the mother who had loved Eric unconditionally for 38 years, wanted to run back upstairs and fix everything. To tell Charles I'd changed my mind, that I would honor Eric's expectations and provide the inheritance he'd been counting on. But the larger part of me, the part that Richard had recognized and trusted, knew that this lesson was not just deserved but necessary. Eric and Vanessa had revealed their true characters so completely over the past week that there could be no doubt about their motivations or their respect for me as a person. My phone rang before I could start the car. Eric's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately. Then again. By the fourth call, I turned off the phone entirely and drove home in silence, needing the sanctuary of my house now legally and completely, to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. I was pouring myself a glass of wine when the doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see Eric's BMW in my driveway and both Eric and Vanessa standing on my front porch. Eric was pacing, his hands running through his hair in the gesture I remembered from his childhood, when he was deeply upset. Vanessa stood rigidly beside him, her earlier tears replaced by something that looked like cold fury. I opened the door, but didn't invite them in. "Mom, we need to talk," Eric said immediately. "This whole situation is insane. We have to figure out how to fix it." "There's nothing to fix, Eric. Your father's will is exactly what he wanted it to be. But it's wrong." Eric's voice cracked with desperation. Dad was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly. "You know he intended for me to inherit the business, to carry on his legacy. Did he? Because from what I heard today, your father was very clear about his intentions." Vanessa stepped forward, her composure cracking. "Aisha, you have to understand, we've made commitments based on the inheritance. Financial commitments that we can't meet without access to the estate." "What kind of commitments?" Eric and Vanessa exchanged a glance, and I could see them calculating how much to reveal. "The restaurant franchise," Eric said finally. "We owe $15 million, with deadlines starting next week." "The Miami real estate," Vanessa added. "We've signed agreements that require us to produce $2 million in funding." "The warehouse property, the tech startup." Eric's voice trailed off as the full scope of his obligations became clear even to him. "How much in total?" I asked, though Charles had already given me the numbers. "About 23 million, Eric whispered. "Maybe more." The sum hung in the air between us, like a death sentence. $23 million in commitments made by a man who earned modest wages and had maybe 80,000 in actual assets. "I see. And you were planning to pay for all of this with money you hadn't actually inherited yet." "Mom, everyone makes investments based on expected income. Dad did it all the time when he was building the business. Your father made investments based on revenue from existing businesses and proven income streams. You made commitments based on money you assumed you would inherit without having to earn it." Vanessa's facade finally shattered completely. "This is ridiculous. You're going to let your son be destroyed financially because of some vindictive game your dead husband decided to play." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Excuse me? You heard me. Richard is dead, Aisha. Whatever petty grudges he held against Eric died with him. You're alive. You have the power to fix this, and you're choosing to let Eric suffer because of some twisted loyalty to a corpse." Eric paled at his wife's words. "Vanessa, don't."
No, Eric. Someone needs to say it.
Your mother is hiding behind your father's will instead of taking responsibility for her own decisions. She could transfer the inheritance to you tomorrow if she wanted to. She's choosing not to." I looked at this woman who had married my son, who had lived in luxury funded by our family's generosity, who had treated me with condescension and disrespect for 5 years. Now, faced with the collapse of her entitled lifestyle, she was showing her true nature completely. "You're absolutely right, Vanessa. I am choosing not to transfer the inheritance to Eric. Would you like to know why? Because you're a bitter old woman who can't stand to see anyone else be happy?" The insult was so crude, so completely lacking in any pretense of respect or affection, that it actually clarified my thinking. This was who Vanessa really was when her mask came off. This was the woman who had influenced my son's transformation from loving child to entitled stranger. "No," I said calmly, "because you just called my husband, Eric's father, a corpse, and suggested that his final wishes were a vindictive game. Because you've shown me exactly what you think of family loyalty and respect for the dead. And because you've demonstrated that you see me as nothing more than an obstacle to wealth rather than a human being deserving of basic courtesy." Eric finally found his voice. "Mom, Vanessa is upset. She didn't mean..." "She meant every word, Eric. And the fact that you're defending her instead of being appalled by her disrespect tells me everything I need to know about where your loyalties lie." My loyalties are with my family.
No, Eric.
Your loyalties are with your wallet. If they were with your family, you wouldn't have spent the week after your father's funeral planning how to spend his money. You wouldn't have lied to investors about having $55 million. You wouldn't have tried to arrange the sale of my home without my knowledge to fund your investment schemes. I stepped back from the door, preparing to close it. Your father left you exactly what you earned, $1 and a lesson about the difference between entitlement and achievement. What you do with that lesson is entirely up to you. Mom, wait. Eric's desperation was palpable. What about the restaurant franchise? The deadline is Monday. If I can't produce the $15 million, they'll sue me for breach of contract. I could lose everything I actually own. Then you should probably contact an attorney to help you understand your options. What options? I don't have $15 million. I don't have access to any significant money without the inheritance. Then perhaps you should have considered that before making commitments based on money you didn't actually have. Vanessa's composure snapped entirely. You selfish bitch. You're going to destroy Eric's life because of your own petty jealousy. Vanessa. Eric grabbed his wife's arm, finally showing some awareness of how completely inappropriate her behavior was. But the damage was done. In her desperation, Vanessa had revealed the absolute contempt she felt for me, the crude calculation that had always been beneath her surface politeness. Get off my property, I said quietly. Both of you. Now. Mom, please. Eric, you have a choice to make. You can continue to enable your wife's disrespect toward me and toward your father's memory, or you can decide that family loyalty actually means something. But you can't have both my support and her contempt. I closed the door before either of them could respond, turning the deadbolt with shaking hands. Through the window, I watched them argue in my driveway for several minutes before finally driving away. My landline rang as I was finishing my wine. Charles Whitmore's voice came through clearly. Aisha, I wanted to check on you. How are you holding up? It's been a difficult afternoon. Eric and Vanessa came by. I imagine they weren't happy. That's an understatement. Vanessa called Richard a corpse and suggested his will was a vindictive game. She also called me a selfish bitch. Charles was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry you had to endure that. But it does confirm that Richard's assessment of their character was accurate. Charles, am I doing the right thing? Eric is facing financial ruin. Those commitments he made, the restaurant franchise, the real estate deals, the penalty clauses alone could bankrupt him. Aisha, let me ask you something. If you gave Eric the money to cover his commitments right now, what do you think you would learn from the experience? I thought about it seriously. That there are no real consequences for his choices. That no matter how reckless his decisions, someone will always rescue him. And what would Vanessa learn? That disrespecting me works. That calling my husband a corpse and calling me a bitch is an effective strategy for getting what she wants.
Exactly.
Richard designed this lesson to be definitive precisely because anything less would be meaningless. Eric needed to face real consequences for his entitlement and dishonesty, or he would never change. But what if he can't handle the pressure? What if this destroys him completely? Then you'll discover what he's really made of. And if he proves himself capable of growth and change, you'll still have the power to help him rebuild, on terms that require genuine respect and appreciation rather than entitlement. After Charles hung up, I walked through my house thinking about the choice I'd made. Every room held memories of Eric's childhood, of the loving little boy who had wanted nothing more than to make his parents proud. But that child was gone, replaced by a man who valued inheritance over integrity, wealth over wisdom. If that man was going to find his way back to the values Richard and I had tried to teach him, it would have to happen through his own efforts, his own choices, his own recognition of what truly mattered in life. The lesson had been delivered. Now, we would all discover whether Eric was capable of learning it. The next 4 weeks were a masterclass in the destruction of entitlement. I learned about Eric and Vanessa's disintegration through a carefully cultivated network of social connections who kept me informed without my having to ask directly. Margaret Worthington, Eleanor Richardson, and Patricia Ashford became my unwitting intelligence network, sharing news about Eric's financial crisis with the concern of friends who assumed I was being kept in the loop by my son. I wasn't. Eric had called me exactly once since the will reading, a brief, desperate conversation where he demanded that I fix this situation before his life was completely destroyed. When I gently suggested that he might want to approach me with respect rather than demands, he'd hung up. The first public sign of their troubles came when their BMW was repossessed from the parking lot of Vanessa's spa. According to Margaret, who heard it from her manicurist, Vanessa had caused quite a scene, screaming at the repo men that there had been a mistake, that she would have them arrested for theft. The poor dear seemed quite distraught, Margaret had reported over lunch. Her manicurist said she was crying and carrying on about how this was all a misunderstanding, how her family's lawyer would sort everything out. The second sign was their restaurant franchise deadline. Charles had kept me informed about Eric's increasingly desperate attempts to secure financing. He'd approached every bank in the city, offering personal guarantees he couldn't back up and making claims about his inheritance that were no longer true. When the first deadline passed without payment, the penalty clauses kicked in immediately. Eric was now liable for not just the $15 million investment, but an additional $3 million in fees and damages. $18 million for a man whose annual salary was $100,000. The franchise company has hired a collection agency, Charles informed me during one of our weekly updates. They're moving aggressively to recover their losses. Eric's credit rating has been destroyed, and they're preparing to garnish his wages. The Miami real estate deal was next to fall. Without the ability to secure financing for the $2 million commitment, Eric had to forfeit his deposits and face breach of contract penalties. Another $600,000 he didn't have. But the most devastating blow came when Brahman Enterprises, my company now, terminated Eric's employment. I hadn't ordered his firing. In fact, I'd specifically told the management team that personnel decisions should be made based on performance and behavior, not family relationships. But Eric's financial crisis had begun affecting his work. He'd been taking calls from creditors during business hours, using company resources to try to arrange personal financing, and had apparently made several inappropriate comments to colleagues about his mother's vindictive refusal to honor his inheritance. When the human resources director called to inform me of Eric's termination, she was clearly uncomfortable delivering the news. "Mrs. Brahman, I want you to know that this decision wasn't made lightly. But Eric's behavior over the past 3 weeks has been disruptive and unprofessional. He's been using company time to handle personal financial matters, and last week he told a client that Brahman Enterprises was experiencing family ownership disputes that might affect our ability to deliver on contracts." "I see. We can't have employees spreading doubt about the company's stability, especially not employees in senior positions. I hope you understand." I did understand. Eric had been so consumed with his financial crisis that he'd sabotaged his own professional standing. In trying to solve his money problems, he destroyed the one source of income he actually had. The social consequences came next. Word of Eric's financial troubles had spread through our circle with the speed that gossip always traveled among people who had too much time and too much interest in each other's misfortunes. But what surprised me was how little sympathy he was receiving. "Honestly, Aisha," Patricia Ashford confided during a charity board meeting, "most people are saying Eric brought this on himself. Making investment commitments before actually inheriting anything? It shows terribly poor judgment." "And that wife of his," Eleanor Richardson added with obvious distaste. "She's been calling people, trying to arrange loans based on Eric's temporary difficulties. As if anyone would lend money to someone facing bankruptcy." The final social humiliation came when Eric and Vanessa were asked to leave their country club. They'd been dining in the club restaurant when the manager approached their table and quietly informed them that their membership had been suspended due to unpaid fees. Apparently, Margaret reported with barely concealed satisfaction, Vanessa made quite a scene. She claimed that her mother-in-law was temporarily controlling the family finances and that payment would be forthcoming. But the manager pointed out that their membership fees had been in arrears for 3 months, well before any inheritance issues. 3 months. Eric had stopped paying club fees even before Richard's death. So confident was he about his coming inheritance that he'd begun living beyond his means even while his father was still alive. The personal toll on Eric and Vanessa's marriage became apparent when Vanessa moved out of their apartment and filed for divorce. The official story was that she was visiting family during a difficult time, but the court documents told a different story. Charles had contacts in the legal community who kept him informed about high-profile divorce filings, and Vanessa's case was making waves. She's claiming that Eric misrepresented his financial situation when they married, Charles informed me. Apparently, she's arguing that she was deceived about his inheritance prospects and therefore shouldn't be liable for debts incurred based on false expectations. Can she do that? She can try. But since they were married when Eric made most of these commitments, and since she was an active participant in the spending decisions, she's likely to be considered equally liable for the consequences. 6 weeks after the will reading, Eric appeared at my door, looking like a broken man. He'd lost weight, his clothes were wrinkled and ill-fitting, and he had the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. "Mom," he said when I opened the door, "can we talk?" I invited him in, noting how he looked around the house, his childhood home, with the expression of someone seeing it for the first time. Or perhaps for the last time. "You look tired, sweetheart. Are you eating enough?" "Not really. I can't afford groceries, and I lost my job 3 weeks ago." "I heard."
I am sorry.
Eric settled heavily on the living room sofa, where he'd spent countless hours as a child watching television and doing homework. Now he looked like a stranger in a familiar place. "Mom, I'm here to apologize. This was unexpected." "For what?" "For everything. For treating you like you were incompetent. For dismissing your intelligence. For lying to investors about having $55 million. For trying to sell your house without your permission. For letting Vanessa disrespect you and Dad's memory." His voice cracked slightly. "For being so greedy and entitled that I forgot what family actually means." I studied my son's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. But what I saw was genuine exhaustion, defeat, and what might have been the beginning of actual wisdom. What brought this on? Losing everything. My job, my wife, my home, my future. Realizing that I destroyed my entire life because I thought I deserved something I hadn't earned. Eric looked around the room again, his gaze lingering on family photographs that showed him at various stages of his childhood. "I keep thinking about what Dad used to tell me when I was little. That respect is earned, not given. That work builds character. That family loyalty means putting love above selfishness." Do you remember those lessons? I remember them. I just forgot how to live them. We sat in silence for several minutes while Eric gathered his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but steady. "Mom, I need you to know that I'm not here to ask for money." "You're not?"
No.
"I made my choices, and I need to live with the consequences. But I am here to ask for something that might be even harder to give." "What's that?" "Forgiveness. And maybe the chance to earn back your respect." I felt tears prick my eyes at the vulnerability in his voice. This was the son I remembered, the child who had been capable of genuine remorse and growth. "Eric, you've always had my love. But you're right, respect has to be earned." "I know. And I know I have a lot of work to do." I've filed for bankruptcy. I'm looking for any job I can find, and I've started therapy to figure out how I became such an entitled person. This level of self-awareness was startling. The Eric I'd known for the past 5 years had never shown any capacity for this kind of honest self-reflection. What about Vanessa? Eric's face hardened slightly. Vanessa filed for divorce and is trying to claim that I defrauded her about my financial prospects when we got married. How do you feel about that? Honestly?
Relieved.
I've spent 5 years becoming someone I don't recognize because I thought that was what she wanted. Now I realize she never wanted me. She wanted the lifestyle she thought I could provide. Eric leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. Mom, I know this sounds crazy after everything I've done, but losing everything has been clarifying. For the first time in years, I can see clearly. I can see what I became, what I lost, what really matters. And what really matters?
Family.
Integrity. Building something through your own efforts instead of expecting it to be handed to you. He looked directly at me. Understanding that you're not just my mother, you're an incredible woman who deserves respect and appreciation, not condescension and manipulation. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of forgiveness. The possibility of rebuilding something real with this man who had once been my beloved child. Eric, what are your plans now? I'm moving to Denver next week. A friend from college has a construction company there, and he's offered me work. Manual labor, honest work. I figure it's time I learned what it feels like to earn every dollar instead of expecting someone else to provide them. That sounds like a good start. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Is there any chance, not now, but someday, that I could earn my way back into your life? Into the family? Not for money or inheritance, but just as your son again. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with years of disappointment and the fragile hope of redemption. I looked at this broken man who had once been my precious child, and I saw both the destruction he'd caused and the possibility of who he might become if he truly learned from his mistakes. Eric, do you understand why your father structured his will the way he did?
Yes.
He wanted to teach me that entitlement destroys character, that respect has to be earned, and that family loyalty is about love, not money. And do you understand why I've chosen to honor his wishes? Because he was right. Because I needed to learn these lessons, and I could only learn them through real consequences. Eric stood up, his movements careful and deliberate. Mom, I'm going to spend however long it takes becoming the man Dad tried to raise and the son you deserve. I don't know if I can ever fully make up for what I've done, but I'm going to try. And if you succeed, if you prove that you've truly learned these lessons, then maybe someday you'll be proud to call me your son again. And maybe someday I'll be worthy of being part of the legacy you and Dad built together. After Eric left, I sat alone in my living room thinking about transformation and redemption. The entitled, arrogant man who had dismissed my intelligence and planned to liquidate my life was gone, destroyed by the very greed that had defined him. In his place was someone who might be capable of becoming the person Richard and I had tried to raise. But that transformation would have to be proven through actions, not words. Through years of different choices, not promises of change. The golden couple who had dismissed my worth and planned to spend my inheritance was no more. In their place was a broken man seeking redemption and a woman who had revealed her true character so completely that even Eric had finally seen through her facade. Justice, it turned out, was indeed a dish best served cold. And it tasted exactly like freedom. 3 years later, I stood on the terrace of my villa overlooking the Mediterranean, watching the morning sun paint the French Riviera in shades of gold and azure. The villa had been my gift to myself for my 62nd birthday, a stunning 19th century property that I'd restored with the same attention to detail that Richard had once brought to his business ventures. I'd earned this view, this peace, this life built entirely on my own terms. The past 3 years had been a revelation. Free from the exhausting drama of managing other people's entitlement and greed, I'd discovered parts of myself that had been buried under decades of putting everyone else's needs first. I'd traveled extensively, pursuing interests that had been set aside during my years as a businessman's wife and enabling mother. I'd learned to speak French fluently, studied art history at the Sorbonne, and become an accomplished photographer through sheer determination and daily practice. More importantly, I'd learned to make decisions based purely on what brought me joy rather than what kept other people happy. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. For the first year after the will reading, I'd second-guessed myself constantly. Every piece of news about Eric's struggles, and there had been many, made me wonder if I'd been too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to let maternal love be overruled by the need for justice. Eric had indeed moved to Denver and taken the construction job with his college friend. The work was hard, manual labor that left him exhausted at the end of each day, living in a small apartment that cost half his monthly salary. The bankruptcy had been finalized, wiping out his debts, but destroying his credit for years to come. Through it all, he'd worked steadily, lived within his means, and slowly begun paying voluntary restitution to some of the creditors who had been harmed by his fraudulent financial representations. It wasn't legally required. The bankruptcy had discharged those obligations, but according to Charles, who maintained discreet contact with Eric's bankruptcy attorney, my son was determined to make things right through his own efforts. For 2 years, I'd heard about his progress only through occasional updates from Charles and the social network that still kept track of our family's business. Eric hadn't contacted me directly, hadn't asked for help or forgiveness or reconciliation. He'd simply worked, rebuilt his life one difficult choice at a time, and honored the lesson his father had tried to teach him. The first letter had arrived on the 2nd anniversary of Richard's death. It was brief, handwritten, and completely unexpected. Dear Mom, I know I have no right to contact you after everything I did, and I'm not writing to ask for anything. I just wanted you to know that I think about you and Dad every day, and that I'm finally beginning to understand the lessons you both tried to teach me. I've been working construction for 2 years now, and I've learned something Dad tried to tell me years ago. There's dignity in honest work that has nothing to do with how much money you make. The men I work with respect me because I pull my weight and show up every day, not because of who my family is or what I might inherit someday. I've also been paying back some of the people I hurt with my lies and greed. It will take me many more years to make things right, but I'm learning that integrity means taking responsibility for your mistakes, not just apologizing for them. I hope you're happy and healthy. You deserve every good thing life can offer, and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that.
Love.
Eric. I'd read that letter dozens of times, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden requests for assistance. But what I'd found was something I hadn't seen from Eric in years: genuine humility and what appeared to be hard-won wisdom. The letters had continued, arriving every few months, each one a small window into Eric's gradual transformation. He'd written about learning to live within his means, about the satisfaction of building things with his hands, about the relationships he'd formed with people who knew nothing about his past wealth or family connections. Working with my hands has taught me something Dad tried to tell me years ago. He'd written in one letter: success isn't about how much money you have. It's about how much value you create for other people. The houses we build will shelter families for generations. That's worth more than any investment portfolio. Gradually, I'd begun to see evidence of the man Richard and I had tried to raise. The entitled, arrogant heir had been stripped away by necessity and consequences, revealing someone who might actually be worthy of respect. The real test had come 8 months ago, when Charles called with unexpected news. Aisha, Eric has been promoted to project manager at his construction company. He's now overseeing the building of affordable housing developments for low-income families. How is that possible? He's only been there 2 years. Apparently, he's shown exceptional dedication and natural leadership abilities. His boss says Eric has a gift for managing complex projects and motivating teams. More importantly, he's known for his integrity, something that's rare in the construction industry. And financially, he's living modestly but comfortably. No debt beyond normal living expenses, a small savings account, and a reputation for honest dealing. He's also continued making voluntary payments to his former creditors, even though he's not legally required to do so. 6 months later, another letter had arrived. Dear Mom, I wanted to share some news with you. I've been promoted to project manager at my company, and we're building housing developments for families who otherwise couldn't afford decent homes. It's the most meaningful work I've ever done. I know this might sound strange coming from someone who once thought success meant accumulating wealth, but I've never been happier or more fulfilled. I wake up every morning knowing that my work makes a real difference in people's lives. I've also finished paying back everyone I could find who was harmed by my dishonesty 3 years ago. It took every extra dollar I could earn, but I've learned that peace of mind is worth more than any luxury. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or to request contact. I know I destroyed your trust and disappointed you and Dad terribly. But I wanted you to know that the lessons you tried to teach me weren't wasted. I'm finally becoming the man Dad wanted me to be. Love always, Eric. Reading that letter on my terrace in France, I'd finally understood that Richard's plan had worked exactly as intended. The harsh lesson had stripped away Eric's entitlement and forced him to develop the character traits that wealth and privilege had prevented him from learning: discipline, humility, the ability to delay gratification, and respect for earned achievements rather than inherited privileges. Yesterday, Charles had called with the news I'd been both hoping for and dreading. Eric would like to see you. Not to ask for anything, Charles had added quickly, but to apologize in person and to show you who he's become. He's coming to Chicago next month for a construction industry conference where he's been invited to speak about affordable housing development. What kind of speaking engagement? He's been selected as a presenter at the National Conference on Sustainable Housing. Apparently, his projects in Denver have become models for other cities. He's gained quite a reputation as an innovative project manager who can deliver quality housing on limited budgets. Did you arrange this opportunity?
No.
Eric earned this recognition through his own work. The conference organizers sought him out based on his professional achievements. What do you think I should do? I think you should trust your instincts. You'll know within 5 minutes whether Eric's transformation is genuine or whether he's learned to be a more sophisticated manipulator. Now, standing in my French villa, I thought about that conversation and about the choice I faced. I could continue my peaceful life in Europe, free from family complications and the potential for disappointment. Or I could return to Chicago and discover whether my son had truly learned the lessons that had cost him everything. My phone rang, interrupting my meditation. Eric's number appeared on the screen, the first time he'd called in 3 years. Hello, Eric.
Mom.
His voice was deeper than I remembered, calmer. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. Charles gave me your number. It's fine. I hear you're coming to Chicago. Yes, for a conference. Mom, I know I have no right to ask, but would you be willing to see me? I understand if you don't want to, but I'd like the chance to apologize properly and to show you who I've become. I looked out at the peaceful Mediterranean, at the life I'd built for myself through 3 years of independence and self-discovery. Soon I would have to decide whether there was room in this life for a relationship with the man my son claimed to have become. I'll be back in Chicago next week, I said finally. We can meet for coffee. Thank you, Mom. I promise I won't ask for anything except the chance to prove that I've learned from my mistakes. After I hung up, I continued to watch the sunrise over the water. In a week, I would discover whether Eric's transformation was real or whether this was simply a more sophisticated version of the manipulation I'd endured years ago. But whatever I learned, I would make the decision from a position of strength rather than weakness, independence rather than enabling, wisdom rather than blind maternal love. Richard had given me the tools to teach Eric about consequences and character. Now Eric would have a chance to demonstrate whether the lesson had been learned. Either way, I would remain exactly what I'd become. Aisha Brahman, a woman who had learned the difference between love and enabling, between family loyalty and financial obligation, between helping and being used. The Queen's Gambit had been played perfectly. Now we would discover what kind of man would emerge from the ruins of entitlement to face the queen he had once dismissed and disrespected. But this time, I would be holding all the cards, and Eric would have to earn his way back into my respect one honest conversation at a time. 3 years ago, Eric had expected to inherit $55 million and had received $1 instead. Now, if he had truly changed, he might earn something far more valuable, the possibility of rebuilding a relationship with his mother based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. The game was far from over. But for the first time in years, I was looking forward to the next move. 3 years later, and Eric's finally walking the walk. But has he really changed? Drop your final thoughts in the comments. Should Aisha give him that second chance? Or is this just another long con? If this story of inheritance drama, financial consequences, and the price of entitlement spoke to your soul, you know what to do. Smash that subscribe button, hit the like, and share this with anyone who's ever been taken for granted by their own family. Remember, respect is earned through actions, not promises. Love doesn't mean enabling bad behavior. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is letting them face the consequences of their own choices. Thanks for taking this incredible journey with me, and I'll see you in the next story.